Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I serve as the lead pastor of Mill Creek Foursquare, and welcome to our podcast. This exists as an extension of the teaching ministry of our pastoral team. Here you're going to be able to find everything from Sunday messages to midweek communications, classes, interviews, conversations with friends. So we hope that you feel invited to participate in the life of our fellowship and receive of this ministry. Here you're going to be able to learn more about current events and much about the scriptures. So enjoy, relax, breathe, and ultimately may you be experiencing the presence of God. Our goal is to make disciples of Jesus who are experiencing his life, engaging in his presence, extending the gospel to their family, neighborhood, workplace, and world. So welcome and enjoy.
Welcome to episode number 8 in our MC4S midweek podcast. I'm John. I'm here with Pastor Trevor.
What's going on?
And here we're going to kick off 3 episodes that are going to be related to one another, all focused on the subject of the rapture. Because all 3 of these are focused on this one topic, this episode and the next 2, and because there's some complexity associated with the topic, we are going to come at it from a number of different angles. And so I wanted to begin this episode by briefly explaining what the next 3 are going to look like. So basically, in this first episode, our goal will be to explore the general sort of concept and the basic theology, if you will, of this rapture idea. We'll talk a little bit about its cultural influence, its theological and historical origins, and we'll talk a little bit also about its potential appeal, some of the reasons that people gravitate toward this idea, but also the implications of it. In the following 2 episodes, we'll focus more attention on the biblical texts themselves, especially given that this is a whole sort of series in our podcast on the book of Revelation. What we'll do in the next episode after this one is talk a little bit about some of the texts within the New Testament broadly that are often understood to support the idea of a rapture. And then we'll focus the majority of our attention in the 3rd episode in this little mini-series on the book of Revelation itself. So our attention to Revelation will still sort of be peppered throughout all 3 of these episodes.
We have not given up on Revelation.
and certainly the idea of the rapture is often associated for many people with the book of Revelation and the whole concept of eschatology or the study of last things. And so there's all kinds of sort of interconnections that we're gonna see. So Trevor, to begin with, many of our listeners, many folks in our audience and in our church will have some awareness of this rapture idea. But just to start us off, and for any who aren't sure exactly what it is, could you describe for us what exactly is the rapture? What do we mean by that term?
Yeah, so in a broad stroke, I was thinking about one of the Left Behind movies. So we'll talk more about it in a minute, but the rapture, the idea of the rapture has been popularized in kind of the cultural imagination through a number of works, whether it's the 1970s, The Late Great Planet Earth by Tim LaHaye. Is that?
Hal Lindsey.
Hal Lindsey. My bad. Okay. Yeah. Hal Lindsey. Or the Left Behind series in the 1990s and the early 2000s, which was Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. And so both of which became bestsellers. But there was a scene. So the Left Behind series became a movie. So they did a first trilogy of movies in the early 2000s starring Kirk Cameron, right? And then they did in 2014, they had Nicolas Cage, of all people, star in another rendition of the Left Behind movie, whatever else. And basically there's this one scene in the movie where I don't know why, I think I watched it because, you know, on Netflix sometimes they tell you when movies are coming off Netflix.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's like, oh, I need to binge this before it comes off Netflix. And so I, for some reason, came across the Left Behind movie with Nicolas Cage, and I'd never seen it. I hadn't read the Left Behind books, whatever else. I was like, okay, I just need to watch this. I've heard people talk about it, whatever else. So I watched the movie, and there's a scene in the movie where Nicolas Cage is, I guess he'd be a stewardess. Well, that'd be the female stewardess. What do you call it?
A flight attendant?
Yeah, flight attendant.
Yeah.
So he's a flight attendant, and he's on the plane. He's just living normal life. He's working, everything. else. And there comes this moment on the plane where in like the flash of a second, a third of everyone on the plane disappears. Their clothes are just left there. And people are crying. They're freaking out. I mean, moms, some of their babies are gone. Family members are torn apart. And then the plane starts to go down. And so Nicolas Cage runs and he's hitting on the cockpit trying to figure out what in the world is happening. And eventually he breaks into the cockpit. And all he sees is the clothes of both pilots laying there. So, of course, Nicolas Cage is the protagonist of our movie. Takes the throttle, somehow lands the plane, which I don't think is a part of flight attendant training, but he lands the plane. And then when he lands the plane, he calls, I believe it was his daughter in the movie, and he realizes that this was not just a phenomenon where people are disappearing on the plane, but it was a phenomenon across the globe. And so end scene and the picture there. And essentially the picture of the rapture, at least in pop culture and even some Christian subcultures and theological systems, which we'll talk about in a minute, is this idea that there's going to be this final kind of climactic culminating moment where all of a sudden followers of Jesus, people who've given their life to follow Jesus, will disappear and be brought up to heaven before the great tribulation is about to take place, the Antichrist, whatever else, that there's going to be this moment of the greatest tribulations that we've ever seen on earth, basically. And so that's essentially the picture of the rapture, again, popularized by the late great Planet Earth, popularized by the Left Behind series and multiple movies. Now, we know that it's kind of consumed the pop culture picture. I know it's not just movies and books, so I think you'd said there were, when we were talking earlier, there's music around this.
Yeah. It's interesting. It was certainly, as you were just talking about, certainly I think some of the novels and then some of the novels published in the 60s and 70s, and then some of the more recent ones as well, and some of those, especially the Left Behind franchise being made into films. I think all of that has had significant influence. But around the same time as Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth was coming out in the 70s, there was also a lot of music. There was an interesting, probably some of our audience and some of our congregation will know about and will have lived through this time period when there was sort of popular Christian music coming out in the 60s and 70s that had a kind of similar feel to some of the classic rock music that was sort of popular more generally in North American culture. And a number of these artists had popular songs that were focused on very similar kinds of themes as these books. The idea of the world ending and an interest in eschatology and an interest in the fate of humanity and specifically in the fate of Christian believers in these sort of final days or last days.
Deep things to sing about.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can kind of imagine that and this kind of thing happens all the time, right? In cultures, like certain themes and ideas tend to coalesce, and and especially when you look back, you can see it in sort of film and art and music. Some of the same kinds of ideas.
You kind of see it everywhere,
percolating. Right? Yeah. And so a great example of this, there was a fellow named Barry McGuire who had a popular song called "The Eve of Destruction" that had, this whole notion
that was a popular song.
Yeah. It was like this whole idea, like I forget the line, but it's like, don't tell me that you don't believe. It's something. It's something like, you can't tell me you don't believe that we're on the eve of destruction. When the lyrics are all sort of, you look around and see what's happening around us. You can't tell me that we're not on the eve of destruction. That's the whole idea of his song. So strong eschatological focus, or a strong focus on the last things or the end of days. But the one that relates most explicitly to the rapture was a song by a guy named Larry Norman called "I Wish We'd All Been Ready." And so if you kind of think about the picture you painted from that Left Behind film, right? The sentiment, the song almost communicates the sentiment of someone sort of looking back on that rapture thing happening and going, "Oh man, I wish we'd all been ready." Like that kind of thing. Like, this thing's going to happen all of a sudden, and some will be taken and some will be left. And it's this, I wish we'd all been ready. And so he even draws language specifically from the biblical text of Luke chapter 17, which we'll talk about a little bit in the next episode. A man and wife asleep in bed. She hears a noise and turns her head. He's gone. I wish we'd all been ready. Two men walking up a hill. One disappears. One's left standing still. I wish we'd all been ready. There's no time to change your mind. The sun has come and you've been left behind. Oh. And so this very...
You said that was a bestseller?
Well, it was a popular song.
It was streaming on your 2020 Spotify list.
Exactly, yeah. But I think it's helpful because that song, those song lyrics sort of capture a similar kind of sentiment and a similar kind of set of ideas as the film scene that you narrated for us. This notion that some kind of rapture event is going to take place where certain portions of humanity will be all of a sudden gone. Yeah. And everyone will be sort of left wondering why or how or whether they should have been part of the group that disappeared and might be left with this sort of I wish we'd all been ready sort of sentiment.
Well, there's that sense, too, of a question mark in the sense that you don't really know. There was this one scene to build off that because the question, it almost seems like a lament in the song when I'm thinking of like, we wish we'd be ready. We were looking backwards of how you'd feel if you were left behind or something. There's a scene where Nicolas Cage in the movie meets a pastor who had been left behind.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm laughing, but it was, there was this picture where he goes to a church because he's like, I need an explanation. I guess I should go to the church. But in the church, like I think the pews, all the people's clothes are gone. And the entire church got raptured, but the lead pastor. So hopefully this isn't Chris, but but the pastor, he just talked about how he realized he wasn't ready. Like he wasn't actually, he'd been preaching and teaching, and there was something almost a question mark associated with it. And I find this when I talk to people about it as well, this theological system too, is there's almost like we don't really know. And so there's this sense of, there's maybe a good, but also a negative sense of uncertainty. It kind of makes you think of the Mark of the Beast conversation last week as well, in the sense of that pop culture idea of uncertainty. Like I don't really know if I'm going to be in the group or not, and that seemed to stand out to me as we're talking about this as well. Now, these are all the pop culture sketches, right? We're talking about common literature, movies, songs, but we also know that there's a historical trajectory, an origin story, and everyone loves a good origin story.
Sure.
And so what is the origin story around the rapture, or even the theological systems that the rapture is associated with? Is this something that the early church believed? Is this something that is newer? Can you give a sketch for us of the origin story of the rapture? Yeah.
It's helpful to think through this. I'm certainly not. I wouldn't count myself as an expert on this sort of area. I know sort of bits and pieces, but it's helpful at the very least to recognize that while there are theological and historical developments to this idea that predate the kinds of things we've been talking about, these relatively recent sort of developments in music and films and popular
the 60s
culture.
and 70s, everything.
Certainly the belief in the rapture and the idea of it goes back a little ways further than that, but not much. It's really not until the 19th century that anything resembling rapture theology actually becomes a thing that anybody's interested in or wants to read biblical texts and try to sort of discern this sort of rapture idea within them. And it tends to be most closely associated with a theological framework called dispensationalism, and especially a figure who was influential in sort of the origins of dispensationalism named John Nelson Darby. He was a preacher, pastor, theologian, an Irish fellow associated with the beginnings of the Plymouth Brethren denomination. And he lived in the 1800s and was pretty instrumental in sort of developing this idea of a rapture. Dispensationalism is a fairly complicated sort of theological idea and framework, and we don't need to sort of get into all the ins and outs of it. But the basic idea of it is that human history can be sort of divided into these multiple dispensations or these different sort of epochs or eras, and that God sort of relates to people in different ways in these different sort of dispensations. So, for example, whereas some theologians and some theological systems, myself, for example, I would hold to a reading of the biblical text and an approach to theology that recognizes strong elements of continuity between God's covenant relationship with Israel and the new covenant established in and through Christ. Dispensationalism would tend to sort of drive more of a wedge between these different kinds of covenants and these different sort of ways that God relates to humanity in these various dispensations. A number of other people were sort of influential in continuing the influence, or continuing the kind of interest in dispensationalism, and within that, this idea of a kind of rapture being a part of that final dispensation, those sort of final days. People like D.L. Moody in the U.S. and Scofield, C.I. Scofield, who had who produced a study Bible that became really popular. These figures were all sort of influential in the dissemination of some of these ideas, or in popularizing both the broader theological system of dispensationalism and then also this particular feature of it called the rapture. And so I think what's especially helpful for us to recognize in just thinking about the fact that this idea has an origin story, as you put it, and that it's fairly recent, it's helpful to recognize that this isn't something that it has just been sort of obvious to all Christians throughout time. It's not something that even really is taught explicitly in the Bible. Yeah. It's a relatively recent theological development that then people tend to assume or try to assume that certain biblical texts teach it or allude to it, or they try to sort of justify it on the basis of a certain kind of reading of particular biblical texts. But it's helpful to recognize that it's a fairly recent development. It doesn't have sort of a long pedigree throughout church history. And many people, many biblical scholars and theologians and church historians would probably all recognize that the exegetical basis for a belief in a rapture and the sort of theological ideas surrounding it have pretty sort of shaky foundations.
Yeah, which I know we're going to get to soon. Now, I think, so what you're hitting on, if I'm understanding right, is the 19th century, I believe 1830 or so, is when this theological system, the rapture, dispensation began to arrive through Darby. And so what you're saying is that for the first 1800 years of the church, there was no belief in a rapture in the way we understand it now, correct?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think when you say that, I mean, that makes me think it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong per se, but what it does is it raises a red flag. Because I always think of this in any theological system, is anytime anyone thinks, especially modern people, we think we figured something out that the greatest minds of church history didn't figure out for the last 2,000 years or 1,800 years or whenever it arose.
Yeah.
It is a red flag.
Yeah.
Because
definitely.
it should raise it. I think there's a chronological snobbery. I think C.S. Lewis is what phrased that. But a chronological snobbery at times where we think as modern people that, hey, we figured something out, where a lot of times, anytime a new theological system arises, even now, the first question is kind of a red flag, just in the sense of saying, okay, how did they figure this out when no one figured that? It doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong again, but it does raise a red or a very strong yellow, like you need to slow down before.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's helpful too to note simply that it can become so easy when our theology is inevitably influenced by so many different sort of sources and realities, some of which we don't even sort of recognize. And it can be helpful to recognize that sort of the life of a Christian will, or should at least, involve a sort of ongoing theological reflection of some sort and a sort of willingness to examine certain features of our beliefs, certain assumptions, certain ways of reading the Bible that that may or may not have, solid foundations, and sometimes are worthwhile sort of calling into question. So within this conversation, I can imagine someone perhaps listening to this conversation and thinking, well, I've just always assumed that the rapture was a thing. I've heard about it. I've maybe heard sermons about it. I thought that this was just like a standard, undeniable feature of the Christian faith or the New Testament story. But it's helpful to sort of recognize it has fairly recent sort of modern development within a sort of specific corner of church history, and these very sort of specific, one might even say idiosyncratic traditions. And it has a kind of popular culture emphasis that has made it seem sort of like, yeah, this must be a thing. And then even for many people, their Bibles might even have headings that say, in Matthew 24 or various, or in 1 Thessalonians 4, there might even be a heading that sort of refers to the rapture. What's crucial to recognize there is that before the Scofield Study Bible and many similar kinds of study Bibles existed, they wouldn't have had those kinds of headings. Those headings aren't sort of part of the actual biblical text that is
Wait, you're
God's
telling
revealed
me my
word.
Chapters aren't divinely inspired? My chapter titles?
Not quite. And very often they are helpful. They're the chapter titles or section titles are produced by sort of teams of scholars and translators who have done this careful work. But it's important for us to recognize that they have their limitations and they are often bound up in specific theological frameworks. And so I think what we're trying to sort of sketch here in the opening part of this conversation is that the idea of the rapture is not just sort of an undeniable feature of the New Testament or
like the early church
Christian
fathers.
You'd
pull open the early church fathers and you'd see them teaching about the rapture. That's what you're saying is not. Yeah.
Right. It's actually a fairly recent development. It has a very sort of specific association with a particular way of doing theology and thinking about the nature of the Bible and God's redemptive purposes in human history. And despite how sort of popularized it has become, it can be really helpful to think through sort of what is the basis for it, for this idea, and how faithful of a reading of the biblical text really is it.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on what we've been talking about with general pop culture and even some Christian subculture about how people approach a text like Revelation, apocalyptic literature, and apocalypse. Because I feel like throughout our series, that's what we've been fundamentally trying to reframe is the assumptions that we as modern people, whether because of pop culture, Christian subculture, whatever else, we've brought to the text that are not the foundations that the text lies on itself. Especially on apocalypse, when we've been talking about apocalypse being in a cultural definition, the cosmic unraveling of everything good, something dreaded, something that produces fear. I think in many ways that's been the heart of what we've been trying to do all along, is trying to reframe in many ways and deconstruct the popular subcultures or understandings around these ideas. Even when I preached on Armageddon a few weeks ago, it was deconstructing this picture of what does the scripture and the text actually say. And we're always in that growth process. So it's not meant to be something, obviously, where we're trying to, I don't know what the word for it is. We're trying to come with humility in the process, but and receive the gift. And I think that's what we're trying to discern. And I think the rapture ties into that as well.
Yeah. So now that we've spent a little bit of time sort of defining what the rapture is, talking a little bit about it, the origins of the idea and the sort of popularity that it has developed in sort of recent decades, certainly in terms of pop culture. What do you think is the appeal of it? I mean, whether it's Darby and
Nicolas Cage, of course.
Well, sure. But whether we're thinking about sort
national treasure.
Yeah.
Sorry, keep going.
No, you're good. Whether we're thinking about sort of specific theological frameworks like dispensationalism and developments within certain sort of corners of Protestant tradition, from Darby to Moody to Scofield and various kinds of things, or whether we're talking about pop culture and music and that kind of, or even just sort of generic kind of assumptions within one's Christian faith. What do you think the appeal is? Like if someone were listening to this and thinking, well, no, I thought rapture was like an important, not only a sort of clear aspect of my Christian faith, but I also thought it was like important. I thought this was like an important and positive thing. What do you think the appeal is of the idea?
I've thought about this a lot because of the numerous conversations. Even when we were preparing for this series, we all had numerous conversations with people from different theological views on the book to be able to plan. I mean, people don't always know that we put months into planning this series, having conversation with folks, from different theological views. It's not like we just walked up there and said, here's how we're approaching this. It was really a kind of unveiling of looking through different theological systems and we all had our own implicit ways of approaching the book as well. But as I've thought about this, I'm not sure it's all that complex, but it obviously can be more complex than what I'm about to say. I really think it comes down to the picture that no one likes the idea of suffering. I don't know a human... and if you are, you're probably a bit messed up, but just kidding. But the picture of just no one likes to suffer. And I think especially a theological system like this has been able to take root in the West because of our lack of suffering and persecution throughout the last few hundred years of the Western church. Now, obviously, there's been rampant persecution throughout other countries and places in other continents, but at least from the church in the West, there's something that we've lived in a place of comfort that has not been experienced throughout church history. For the most part, much of the church has been persecuted. And so we've been given this, in some ways, a period of time, whether you can say that's good or bad. I mean, we could debate that. But we've given this period of time where we have had a certain freedom around worship, a certain freedom around gathering and other things and the like. And so I believe the rapture speaks to us in many ways to that sense of our Western comfort. It speaks to a place of saying that, I mean, if anyone came to me and said, hey, Trevor, you're going to miss the greatest tribulation the world's ever seen. You're going to get right before the trials start, right before the struggles start, right before the testing comes and the temptations come, you're going to be brought out of the world, and then the whole thing is going to kind of, go downhill or something. Who wouldn't be appealed to that idea? And I think that really speaks to it, though I don't think it really speaks to most of the global church today. I think in many ways there's a reason the rapture has only taken root in certain, I would say, groups of people, certain countries, whatever else. And it has not taken root in many non-Western countries and not taken root in minority communities because they're peoples who actually understand persecution. They're people who understand active persecution, which really reframes and actually probably invites you into actually understanding the biblical story better. Because whether it's the Old Testament story and the people of God with the Babylons and the Assyrians and all the big bad guys around them and the global powers that be, whether that be the early church, the church throughout its history and the people of God have known persecution. I mean, that's something they've understood. And that's many of the books and texts we have been framed in this place of suffering and persecution. So when we come as a people who are not actively persecuted, as Westerners or Americans, whatever else, we have a lens that I would say is foreign to the people who wrote the scriptures and actually experienced it. An example I used a few weeks ago, I believe, was about the Chinese church. In the Chinese church in the 20th century, we know there's great persecution. The 20th century, we have seen one of the greatest movements of God in history in the Chinese church. And what basically took place was early in the 20th century, Western missionaries had come in, and throughout the history, Western missionaries have been coming in, planting churches, making disciples, everything else. But there came a period where Western missionaries got taken out of the country. They got sent out of the country as the country closed again, and the church had to go underground. Now, as Western missionaries prepared the Chinese church for tribulation trials, one popularized idea was they told them about the rapture. They said there was going to be these days that you're going to be vanished, you're going to be brought up, and then there's going to be the great tribulation, the Antichrist, all these sort of things. But when Western missionaries got taken from the country and sent out of the country, people in the Chinese church actually believed the rapture happened. They thought they got left behind.
Sure.
Now, they eventually figured out that they did not get left behind, that they were just facing something that the church had faced throughout their history, persecution and suffering. Yet it really brought a sense of clarity around their eschatology. There's one quote I have that one Chinese elite church said that I thought was very compelling. They said, "You told us that we are not going to experience the great tribulation, right? You told us there was going to be a rapture. We thought you had left us behind to endure this on our own, but God has used us. We do not need you here. We can do this on our own." Another leader flat out said, "You lied to us about the rapture." And why did they come? Because they were a people who faced active suffering and persecution. They were people who were going through tribulation. And so I think the theologicalism of the rapture takes root in a certain place, especially within a popular culture like America, because we are people who are comfortable and we like our comfort. And that includes me. I mean, that includes, I'm not trying to say that look at Trevor. He's suffering. He wakes up at 3 a.m. every day and my knees are bleeding from prayer or something. But that is the reality. And I think it really brings us back to, again, the origins of the primitive church. It brings us back to the origins of the early church in the book of Acts. It actually, suffering actually resonates more deeply with the story of the scriptures and even the life of Jesus. I mean, I think of the words of Jesus in John 16:33. I just put a couple verses here. Jesus said this the night before he was about to be crucified. He said, I've said these things to you in John 16:33, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. When Jesus, you will have tribulation, it just strikes me, I don't want to say it's a promise, but it seems to be at some level, he's saying you will, if you're the people of God, if you're following me, you will experience something in the world. In the book of Acts, in Acts 14, the same word for tribulation used again in the New Testament. In the book of Acts, right, the story of the early church, we're told this in Acts 14:21 through 22. It says, when they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples. So Paul and his gang are going from community to community, planting churches, pioneering, and they're coming back, recircling around to strengthen these disciples that they've raised up in these churches they planted. And notice what they're told in verse 22. It says they're encouraging them to continue in the faith and saying that through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. Like a part of the 101 preparation for the early church was part of the discipleship curriculum. Early church was to say that through many tribulations, you must enter the kingdom. This is 101. This is rooted, right? This is rooted for the early church, is to say, hey, suffering is a part. I mean, the Chinese church, Chinese pastors, they actually started to speak of getting sent to jail as their seminary.
Okay.
That actually they determined not your degrees, but how long you spent in prison was actually your level of preparation for being called into ministry. The book of Revelation uses the word tribulation again and again. And it's the same word for tribulation that we've seen throughout the New Testament. Revelation chapter 7, we're told of this. They said, these are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Again, the same word for tribulation that we've seen consistently throughout the New Testament. John, in chapter 1 of Revelation, verse 9, he says, I, John, your brother, and partner in the tribulation. John says he is one who's going through the tribulation. He's actually given us a framework for what tribulation actually means, which is not some distant moment, but it's a sense of the trials and tribulations that people consistently, the church has gone throughout the history of God's people. And finally, John 17:15. This will be my last verse, okay? Jesus, in that prayer that we talked about a little bit earlier, he says, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. I mean, when Jesus is praying for his disciples, the night before he's about to be crucified, before they're about to be scattered, before they're about to be, their lives will be in the line as well for following Jesus, his prayer is not to take them out of suffering, is not to take them out of the world. And so if we come back to this idea of this picture of the rapture, it seems thoroughly inconsistent with what we've seen throughout the theology of the New Testament, the way of Jesus, the early church. And yet all of a sudden, this view has been popularized that all of a sudden when we get to the end of the Bible, everything changes. And I think that's what we've been seeing throughout the book, is that for some reason we treat Revelation as this kind of, it's its own thing. It's the end, it's its own thing. It even, like when I was talking about Armageddon a few weeks ago, the picture of Jesus, the picture of the church, the picture of the people of God is thoroughly consistent with the entire biblical story. Eugene Peterson goes as far to say that there is nothing new in the book of Revelation, meaning that John is taken from the Hebrew Bible, he's taken from the theology of the New Testament, and he's actually just putting it together in one kind of final picture here.
Yeah.
And so I guess to summarize on my long rant here about is just, I think the appeal, if we go back to it, is a place of comfort. And it speaks to us as a place of comfortable, cushy lives that we live in many ways. I'm not saying everyone's life is, because especially in COVID, not everyone's life is comfortable right now. And COVID is actually in some ways raised the levels beyond of what we're normally used to. But I would say in our normal everyday experience, especially in the sense of persecution, that's not something we overtly necessarily experience, though that could be changing in where we are. I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that?
Maybe just to try, I'll just try to summarize what we've discussed, because I think what you've just done is really helpful. You've described for us the reality that there is an understandable appeal to this idea. If there's something called tribulation in the Bible and in the book of Revelation, and if there's something that we just know as humans, that sort of hardship and suffering and difficulty will come about, just as Jesus promised us. Yeah. There is a completely understandable appeal to this idea that somehow being a Christian puts one in a position to experience some kind of escape, some kind of rapture, some kind of, because of my faithfulness or because I belong to this community, I'm going to somehow avoid or escape or be spared from going through this kind of thing. So I think it's helpful to recognize that the appeal is understandable and that it's to some extent natural, and yet what you've just beautifully done there for us is insisted that the dominant trajectory, if you will, of New Testament theology insists that what it means to be a Christian has never been and will never be about sort of escaping this world, avoiding suffering, that kind of thing. But rather, the consistent call to a kind of costly discipleship, to use Bonhoeffer's term, is faithfulness in the midst of whatever life brings. And as you've just shown us, very often the scriptures even promise us that various forms of suffering and hardship and tribulation will come about, and yet the call is faithfulness. And so I think what we've done in this episode so far is tried to sort of signal that the idea of a rapture is not a kind of inevitable aspect of any sort of Christian theological system. It's not really a concept that even has very strong biblical support, as we'll explore next time. It's a fairly recent theological development that has pretty sort of a pretty specific and somewhat narrow kind of development within this one corner of this one tradition. Yeah. And then it tends to take on a certain kind of popular appeal. But there are, especially in light of what you've just said, I think there are really good reasons for us to reevaluate this concept of the rapture and whether the biblical texts that supposedly teach about it, whether they actually do on a sort of responsible and wise reading. And then on the basis of that, we should reevaluate whether the concept of a rapture really belongs within a good reading of a book like Revelation, or whether we would want, or whether perhaps, as I think you've just articulated for us, perhaps the notion of a rapture undercuts the essence of the theological message of Revelation that we've been learning about throughout our series so far. So, thanks for listening. In the next episode, we will. In the next two episodes, we'll continue our discussion of the rapture. But thanks for being with us for this one. This episode, as usual, has been edited by Tim Machira. It's been produced by Dave Sproul, and we've had music from Sherry Machira.
Thank you for joining us. And should you want more information or to engage with us further, please go to mc4s.org for more.